The galaxy of Warhammer 40K is an endless, sprawling void of chaos, ambition, and despair, where empires rise and fall upon the capricious tides of fate. The Horus heresy had just concluded, and the galaxy teetered on the edge of total collapse. The once glorious Imperium of man was fractured, bleeding from its countless wounds inflicted by betrayal, corruption, and unrelenting war. It was an age of reckoning, where the very foundations of humanity's dominion were shaken, leaving behind a legacy of division and mistrust. In this turbulent aftermath, the Legiones Astartes, the superhuman warriors created to serve as the Imperium's champions, stood at a crossroads. Once united as the Emperor's chosen sons, they had splintered into isolated factions, torn apart by allegiance and ideology. The Codex Astartes, penned by the Ultramarines Primarch Robert Guilliman, sought to impose order by fragmenting these vast armies into smaller, more manageable chapters. This act, while intended to safeguard humanity's future, sowed seeds of discontent among those who had thrived on their former strength and autonomy. It was during this fragile period of rebuilding that the event known as the Great Reaving began to take shape. This was not a singular moment of upheaval, but rather a cascading series of betrayals, struggles for power, and ideological clashes that would ignite a firestorm across the galaxy. The term Great Reaving evokes images of blood-soaked battlefields, shattered alliances, and the unyielding thirst for supremacy that defined this dark chapter of the Imperium's history. To understand the Great Reaving, one must grasp the galaxy's precarious state during this time. Humanity's dominion was a fragmented shadow of its former self, its borders besieged by alien threats, heretical uprisings, and the ever-looming menace of chaos. The Imperium, stretched to its breaking point, relied on the fragile cooperation of its myriad factions, each nursing their own wounds and ambitions. The Astartes, now divided into thousands of chapters, no longer wielded the unifying purpose they once held during the Great Crusade. This era of uncertainty bred opportunity for those bold or desperate enough to seize it. Forgotten oaths, simmering rivalries, and ambitions long suppressed began to bubble to the surface. For many, the rigid doctrines of the Codex Astartes were seen not as salvation, but as chains binding them to a weakened Imperium. The galaxy's edges grew wild, lawless, and ungovernable, while even the Imperium's heartland saw growing dissent and rebellion. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one not fought for ideals or survival, but for control, vengeance, and the spoils of war. But what exactly triggered this cataclysmic series of events? Who were the key players that brought the galaxy to this state of chaos? What were the deeper currents of ideology, mistrust, and ambition that drove the Great Reaving? These questions lead us into the heart of the story, where heroes, villains, and opportunists alike shaped the destiny of countless worlds. As the galaxy plunged into this new age of strife, its inhabitants, whether mighty warriors clad in power armor or the ordinary denizens eking out a meager existence, could only brace themselves for the storm to come. The Great Reaving was not merely a chapter in the Imperium's history. It was a crucible that forged legends, shattered empires, and left scars that would endure for millennia. This is the story of how it began. The Great Reaving unfolded amidst a galaxy already teeming with complex factions and ambitious players, each with their own agendas and roles. Central to this period were the Legiones Astartes chapters, whose fragmentation after the Horus heresy formed the backdrop of the chaos to come. Many of these chapters had embraced their new identities, adhering to the Codex Astartes and striving to serve the Imperium faithfully. Yet others, dissatisfied with the new order or harboring grudges, became pivotal actors in the events that would soon engulf the galaxy. Among these were the remnants of traitorous forces who had survived the Horus heresy, lurking in the shadows of the Imperium. These renegades, scattered across the galaxy, saw the growing discontent among loyalist chapters as an opportunity to sow further division and chaos. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by encouraging rebellion and exploiting instability. Their actions, while subtle, served as sparks in the volatile powder keg that defined the era. On the other hand, the Imperium's political and military institutions, including the High Lords of Terra, found themselves wrestling with the implications of their authority over the Astartes. While they sought to enforce the Codex Astartes and maintain order, their decisions often created friction with chapters that perceived them as overreaching bureaucrats rather than legitimate leaders. This tension underscored the growing divide between the Imperium's rulers and its defenders. Another key faction was the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose influence over the Astartes was both indispensable and fraught with conflict. The Mechanicus' role in supplying war gear, managing the flow of resources, and maintaining ancient technologies placed them at the heart of the Imperium's war machine. However, their own secretive nature and relentless pursuit of knowledge often put them at odds with both loyalists and renegades, positioning them as a faction whose involvement could tip the scales in unexpected ways. The rogue trader fleets, operating at the edges of Imperial space, also played a subtle but significant role. These independent agents, licensed to explore and exploit the galaxy's fringes, found themselves entangled in the turmoil. Their ability to move freely through uncharted regions made them invaluable as brokers, informants, and opportunists. Some chose to align themselves with loyalist chapters, while others were drawn to the allure of rebellion or personal gain. Within the fragmented ranks of the Astartes, notable chapters stood out for their unique positions during this period. Those closely aligned with Guilliman's vision served as enforcers of the Codex, striving to bring rebellious elements to heel. Meanwhile, certain chapters, particularly those with proud histories and traditions that clashed with Guilliman's reforms, became rallying points for resistance against the Codex's strictures. In addition to the Astartes and Imperial factions, the galaxy's alien species saw the Great Reaving as a chance to exploit the Imperium's weakness. Certain Xenos factions, long suppressed during the Great Crusade, re-emerged in this era to raid vulnerable systems, further exacerbating the instability. Their actions created additional layers of complexity, forcing the Imperium to divert resources and attention away from internal strife. Finally, there were unaffiliated warbands and renegades, groups of Astartes, human militias, and mercenaries who had broken free from Imperial oversight entirely. These forces acted with impunity, often carving out their own fiefdoms in the lawless regions of space. Their motivations ranged from survival to outright conquest, and their unpredictable actions made them both a symptom and a cause of the chaos engulfing the galaxy. Each of these factions, whether bound by loyalty, ambition, or desperation, played a role in shaping the events of the Great Reaving. Together, they created a maelstrom of competing interests, where alliances shifted as quickly as battle lines were drawn. The stage was set for the galaxy to erupt in a conflict where every participant sought to bend the chaos to their own ends. The Great Reaving did not emerge from a vacuum, but was instead the culmination of deep-rooted tensions and unresolved conflicts that had simmered across the galaxy for decades. The seeds of this upheaval were sown during the final stages of the Horus heresy, as the Imperium fractured under the weight of betrayal and catastrophic losses. The scars left behind by that civil war never fully healed, leaving the galaxy vulnerable to further discord. One of the most significant factors leading to this period of strife was the widespread mistrust and resentment that lingered after the heresy. The Imperium's reliance on the Astartes had once been absolute, but their role in the rebellion created an enduring suspicion among the Imperium's governing bodies. The creation of the Codex Astartes was intended to prevent the rise of similar threats by decentralizing power, yet its implementation introduced as many problems as it sought to resolve. Many chapters, particularly those with strong traditions of independence, viewed the Codex as an attempt to strip them of their autonomy. This resentment festered, laying the groundwork for future conflicts. The galaxy's geopolitical landscape also played a critical role. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Imperium's borders were stretched thin, and countless systems fell into disarray. Planets that had once enjoyed the protection of centralized rule found themselves isolated, forced to fend off alien threats, rogue warlords, and heretical uprisings on their own. This fragmentation created power vacuums that various factions sought to exploit, setting the stage for larger-scale conflicts. The distribution of resources became another flashpoint. The Imperium's economy, already strained by the demands of constant warfare, struggled to supply its many factions. Chapters that adhered to the Codex Astartes often received preferential treatment, while those that resisted its mandates found themselves starved of the equipment and manpower necessary to maintain their strength. This inequity bred further division, driving many chapters to seek alternative means of securing what they needed to survive. Philosophical and ideological divides added yet another layer of complexity. Some factions viewed the Imperium's reliance on the Codex as a betrayal of its founding principles, believing it undermined the unity and strength that had once defined humanity's empire. Others saw it as a necessary adaptation to the harsh realities of a galaxy at war. These conflicting perspectives created an environment where cooperation was increasingly rare, and the smallest disagreements had the potential to escalate into full-blown confrontations. At the same time, external pressures on the Imperium amplified these internal divisions. Alien species, long kept at bay during the Great Crusade, seized the opportunity to attack vulnerable systems. These incursions further stretched the Imperium's resources, forcing chapters and sectors to prioritize local defense over broader cooperation. In many cases, this lack of unity allowed rogue factions to operate with impunity, exacerbating the instability. The rise of splinter groups and unaffiliated warbands was another significant precursor to the Great Reaving. As the centralized authority of the Imperium weakened, countless rogue elements took advantage of the chaos to carve out territories of their own. These groups, often composed of disillusioned Astartes, Imperial Guard units, or other militarized factions, pursued their own agendas with little regard for the broader consequences. Their actions destabilized entire regions, creating a ripple effect that spread across the galaxy. Finally, the absence of a clear and unifying purpose for the Astartes played a crucial role. During the Great Crusade, their mission had been clear: to conquer and unite the galaxy under the banner of the Imperium. After the heresy, that sense of purpose was replaced by a fragmented and often contradictory set of directives. Some chapters sought to uphold their oaths to the Imperium, while others turned inward, prioritizing their own survival and interests. This lack of cohesion ensured that any spark could ignite the tinderbox of discontent that spanned the galaxy. The Great Reaving was not an inevitable event, but its foundations were laid by decades of mistrust, division, and unmet needs. It was born of a galaxy still reeling from its greatest betrayal, where every faction pursued its own goals in a desperate bid for survival or dominance. The confluence of these factors created an environment where conflict was not only possible, but perhaps unavoidable. This volatile mix of causes set the stage for a period of unparalleled turmoil, whose full implications would only become clear as the galaxy descended into chaos. The Great Reaving began subtly, with events that seemed unrelated at first, but gradually coalesced into a galaxy-wide upheaval. The initial signs were sporadic conflicts, often arising in regions where central imperial authority was weakest. These skirmishes involved isolated chapters of Astartes, clashing with imperial forces or other factions over territorial claims, resource disputes, or ideological differences. These early confrontations were largely dismissed by the wider Imperium as isolated incidents, the inevitable consequence of a galaxy in disarray. As these conflicts multiplied, patterns began to emerge. Certain chapters, particularly those that resisted the implementation of the Codex Astartes, were increasingly implicated in acts of defiance. Some refused orders from Central Command, while others outright abandoned their responsibilities to the Imperium, prioritizing their own survival or ambitions. These acts of insubordination, though scattered, began to erode the already fragile unity among the Astartes. Meanwhile, in the distant reaches of the galaxy, rogue warbands and splinter groups began carving out domains of their own. These factions, often composed of disillusioned Astartes or renegade human forces, seized upon the chaos to assert their dominance over lawless regions. Their actions emboldened others, as the lack of immediate repercussions demonstrated the Imperium's inability to enforce its will across its fractured territories. What began as isolated acts of rebellion quickly escalated into widespread defiance. The Imperium, for its part, struggled to respond effectively. The High Lords of Terra, preoccupied with maintaining order in the core worlds, often underestimated the severity of the unrest brewing in the outer reaches. Efforts to enforce compliance with the Codex Astartes only deepened the rifts among the Astartes, as many chapters viewed these attempts as heavy-handed and illegitimate. In response, some chapters banded together, forming loose alliances based on mutual interests or shared grievances. Tensions reached new heights as these alliances began launching coordinated raids and assaults. Initially targeting resource depots and supply lines, these actions soon escalated to attacks on strategic installations and even rival chapters. The scale and intensity of these confrontations grew rapidly as each act of aggression provoked retaliation, creating a cycle of violence that spiraled out of control. At the same time, opportunistic Xenos forces took advantage of the Imperium's internal strife. Raids by alien factions on vulnerable systems forced chapters and Imperial forces to divert resources away from internal conflicts, further weakening their ability to respond effectively. This external pressure exacerbated existing tensions as chapters accused one another of abandoning their duties or failing to defend key regions. As the chaos spread, the Adeptus Mechanicus found itself drawn into the conflict. Their role as the primary suppliers of war gear and technology made them targets for both loyalist and renegade factions. In some cases, Mechanicus forges were seized by force, while in others, they chose sides based on the potential benefits or threats posed by different factions. These actions further destabilized the situation, as access to advanced weaponry became a critical factor in determining the outcome of local conflicts. The fragmentation of the rogue trader fleets added yet another layer of complexity. These independent operators, initially valued for their ability to navigate uncharted regions, began taking sides in the conflict, either out of necessity or personal gain. Their knowledge of trade routes and access to resources made them valuable allies or dangerous adversaries, depending on their allegiances. The culmination of these developments was the widespread realization that the Imperium's authority was no longer absolute. Chapters that had previously hesitated to act against the Codex Astartes now saw open defiance as a viable option. The galaxy descended into a state of near-total anarchy as countless factions vied for power, resources, and survival. What had begun as scattered incidents of unrest had transformed into a full-scale reaving, a relentless tide of violence and ambition that swept across the stars. This period, marked by rapid escalation and shifting alliances, set the stage for the events that would define the Great Reaving. Each faction believed they could navigate the chaos to their advantage, but few could predict the devastating consequences of their actions. The galaxy, already scarred by betrayal and war, now faced a new kind of conflict, one driven not by ideology or loyalty, but by the raw desire for dominance in a fractured and unpredictable universe. The turning point that truly ignited the Great Reaving began with a single cataclysmic betrayal that echoed across the galaxy. This event unfolded when a previously trusted chapter of Astartes, long regarded as stalwart defenders of the Imperium, declared their independence in a public and dramatic fashion. The chapter's leadership, citing the Imperium's inability to protect its outer territories and the perceived tyranny of the Codex Astartes, issued a defiant proclamation to the High Lords of Terra. They announced their withdrawal from Imperial authority, declaring their homeworld and surrounding systems as a sovereign domain. This declaration was not a mere act of rebellion, but a calculated strike designed to destabilize the Imperium further. To prove their resolve and send an unmistakable message, the chapter launched a coordinated assault on a strategically vital fortress world, which served as a major hub for Imperial logistics. The world's defenses were strong, but the attacking forces exploited their insider knowledge of Imperial tactics, striking with a precision that left the defenders reeling. Within days, the fortress fell, its garrison overwhelmed and its valuable resources seized by the renegade chapter. The fallout from this act was immediate and devastating. The loss of the fortress world sent shockwaves through the Imperium, not only because of its strategic value, but also because it demonstrated the vulnerability of its defenses. Loyalist chapters and Imperial commanders were forced to confront the grim reality that even their most trusted allies could turn against them. The psychological impact of this betrayal was as significant as the material losses, shattering the fragile trust that held the Imperium's forces together. In response, the High Lords of Terra issued a decree branding the chapter as traitors and calling for their immediate extermination. Task forces were hastily assembled, drawing from loyalist chapters and Imperial Navy fleets. Yet, the sheer speed and coordination of the renegades' actions gave them a critical advantage. They had already fortified their holdings and prepared for the inevitable retaliation. The conflict quickly escalated, with the rebellious chapter leveraging its newfound resources to launch a series of preemptive strikes against nearby Imperial forces. These strikes targeted supply lines, shipyards, and other critical infrastructure, further destabilizing the region. The chapter's actions emboldened other factions, both within the Astartes and beyond, who had long harbored grievances against the Imperium. Across the galaxy, pockets of resistance and rebellion flared as others took inspiration from the chapter's bold defiance. What set this event apart from previous uprisings was its ripple effect. This single act of defiance created a cascade of repercussions as alliances shifted and new conflicts erupted in its wake. Certain loyalist chapters, already struggling with the demands placed upon them, began questioning their own allegiances. The Imperium's resources were stretched thinner with each passing day, forcing difficult decisions about which battles could be fought and which territories had to be abandoned. Meanwhile, the rebellious chapter's declaration also drew the attention of opportunistic Xenos factions. Seeing the Imperium distracted by internal conflict, these alien forces launched their own incursions into human space, compounding the chaos. While the Imperium scrambled to contain the rebellion, it also had to defend its borders against these external threats, further straining its capacity to respond effectively. Within the rebel chapter itself, the decision to break away from the Imperium was not without its own internal challenges. Not all of its members were united in their support for this drastic course of action, and schisms began to form as some questioned whether their defiance could truly succeed. Despite these internal struggles, the chapter's leadership remained resolute, doubling down on their efforts to consolidate power and expand their influence. This event marked a decisive moment in the Great Reaving, transforming a series of scattered conflicts into a full-blown galactic crisis. It was the spark that ignited the broader conflagration, as factions across the galaxy were forced to choose sides in the growing divide. For the Imperium, it was a stark reminder of its own fragility, exposing the deep cracks in its foundations that had been hidden beneath the surface for centuries. The legacy of this betrayal would shape the course of the Great Reaving, as its consequences rippled across the galaxy, drawing countless factions into the maelstrom of conflict. The stage was set for a prolonged and devastating period of war, the likes of which the Imperium had not seen since the Horus heresy, and the galaxy braced itself for the trials to come. The immediate effects of the Great Reaving reverberated across the galaxy, altering the balance of power and reshaping the Imperium's political and military structures. The most apparent impact was the rapid escalation of instability, as systems that had once been loosely tethered to Imperial control fell into complete chaos. The Imperium's already fragile cohesion shattered further, leaving entire sectors in a state of anarchy. Local governors, unable to rely on reinforcements, declared independence or formed alliances with rogue factions to secure their territories. The weakening of centralized authority opened the floodgates for opportunistic forces. Rogue warbands, unaffiliated Astartes chapters, and alien species capitalized on the disarray, carving out territories and raiding vulnerable worlds. For many citizens of the Imperium, the Great Reaving transformed their lives from tenuous stability to outright terror. Entire planetary populations were displaced as the violence spread, and many found themselves conscripted into makeshift militias or forced to flee into lawless regions. The economic and logistical infrastructure of the Imperium, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of constant conflict. The supply routes that connected Forge worlds, hive cities, and frontier outposts were severed, leading to shortages of weapons, ammunition, and even basic necessities. This disruption not only crippled the Imperium's ability to wage war, but also plunged countless worlds into famine and unrest. Even loyalist chapters found themselves struggling to maintain operational readiness as the flow of resources dwindled. Politically, the Great Reaving deepened the mistrust between the Imperium's institutions. The High Lords of Terra, desperate to reassert control, introduced increasingly draconian measures, which only served to alienate more chapters and planetary governors. The Adeptus Mechanicus, critical to the war effort, began withholding support from factions it deemed unreliable, prioritizing its own survival over broader Imperial goals. These fractures made coordinated responses nearly impossible, allowing the conflict to spiral further out of control. On a broader scale, the Great Reaving altered the strategic priorities of the Imperium. Defending the core worlds and vital Forge worlds became paramount, often at the expense of less strategically important regions. Entire sectors were effectively abandoned, their populations left to fend for themselves against marauders and alien invaders. This retreat marked a significant shift in Imperial policy, from one of aggressive expansion to a desperate struggle for containment and survival. The effects of the Great Reaving extended beyond the immediate losses. The conflict fundamentally reshaped the galaxy's power dynamics, creating a patchwork of warring factions, lawless zones, and independent polities. In many ways, the galaxy became a darker and more fragmented place, where survival depended on alliances of convenience and the ability to exploit chaos. The Astartes, once seen as paragons of loyalty and unity, became symbols of discord, their fragmented chapters representing the fractured state of the Imperium itself. Had the Great Reaving not occurred, the galaxy might have been spared some of its most destructive conflicts. Without the widespread rebellions and betrayals, the Imperium could have focused its resources on rebuilding after the Horus heresy. The stability provided by a united Astartes force might have allowed humanity to push back against alien threats more effectively, securing its borders and reclaiming lost territories. The absence of the Great Reaving could have preserved countless lives and avoided the economic collapse that plagued the Imperium during this period. However, the absence of the Great Reaving might also have allowed other threats to fester unchecked. The underlying divisions within the Imperium would not have vanished, but remained hidden, potentially erupting at an even more catastrophic moment. The galaxy's volatile nature, shaped by millennia of war and ambition, ensured that conflict was never far away. Even without the Great Reaving, the Imperium's fragility would have left it vulnerable to other crises. In the end, the Great Reaving's immediate impact was one of widespread suffering and chaos. It reshaped the galaxy, leaving scars that would endure for millennia and fundamentally altering the trajectory of the Imperium. For those who lived through it, this period became a grim reminder of humanity's precarious existence in an uncaring galaxy, where every victory came at an immeasurable cost. The Great Reaving is a period in Imperial history that remains shrouded in controversy and fascination, largely due to its unique aspects that continue to spark debates among scholars and fans alike. One of the most intriguing elements of this era lies in the interplay of technology and tactics that emerged as a result of the chaos. With traditional supply chains severed and the Imperium's ability to enforce strict oversight diminished, the conflict became a proving ground for innovation, desperation, and brutal efficiency. During the Great Reaving, many factions turned to scavenging and reverse engineering ancient technologies to maintain their war efforts. This led to the resurgence of relics and weapon systems that had been thought lost or rendered obsolete. Among these were devastating siege engines and rare variations of power armor, some of which had not been deployed since the Great Crusade. These rediscovered technologies not only gave certain factions a temporary advantage, but also left a lasting mark on the Imperium's arsenal, as these innovations were either reintegrated into standard practices or became coveted trophies. The tactics employed during the Great Reaving were equally unorthodox. With many chapters and factions operating independently, conventional strategies often gave way to guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run assaults, and psychological operations. The lack of centralized coordination led to an unprecedented degree of adaptability, as commanders tailored their methods to the specific challenges of their theaters of war. This period saw the rise of strategies that relied on subterfuge and misdirection, with entire campaigns being fought in the shadows before culminating in decisive battles. One of the most notable examples of these tactics involved the use of ambushes in warp transit. Renegade factions, having gained intimate knowledge of Imperial fleet patterns, began to exploit the dangers of warp travel to intercept and destroy their enemies. By attacking vessels while they were most vulnerable, these factions inflicted devastating losses on the Imperium's ability to project power across the galaxy. The psychological toll of these attacks was immense, as even the safest routes became treacherous, sowing fear and hesitation among loyalist forces. Another unique aspect of the Great Reaving was the role of the Adeptus Mechanicus. While their forges were vital to the war effort, the Mechanicus' fragmented allegiances and their obsession with technological discovery often placed them at odds with both loyalist and renegade factions. In some cases, Forge worlds openly defied Imperial decrees, hoarding resources or striking deals with rogue warbands in exchange for rare artifacts and data. This period also saw the rise of breakaway Mechanicus sects that pursued their own goals, contributing to the chaos with experimental weapons and machines of war that were as unpredictable as they were powerful. The Great Reaving also highlighted the vulnerability of the Imperium's reliance on astropathic communication and navigation. With warp storms intensifying and the galaxy's instability creating disruptions in the Astronomicon, many regions found themselves cut off from reliable communication. This isolation forced commanders to make critical decisions without guidance, leading to a patchwork of conflicting strategies and objectives. The loss of astropathic networks also allowed misinformation to spread unchecked, with entire campaigns being based on false intelligence or rumors. One of the most debated aspects of this era is the extent to which external forces, particularly chaos, manipulated events. While direct involvement from demonic entities was rare, there are numerous accounts of subtle influence shaping key decisions and events. The disruption of the Astronomicon and the spread of warp-based phenomena during this period have led some to speculate that chaos actively sought to exacerbate the conflict, using the Great Reaving as a tool to weaken the Imperium further. This theory remains contentious, with some arguing that the galaxy's inherent volatility was enough to explain the events without requiring external interference. The cultural and psychological impact of the Great Reaving is another unique facet that continues to intrigue. For many within the Imperium, this period represented the ultimate failure of unity and loyalty. It created a lasting sense of paranoia, as even the most trusted allies were capable of betrayal. This legacy shaped the attitudes and doctrines of countless factions, fostering a culture of suspicion and preemptive aggression that persists to this day. Finally, the Great Reaving's role in redefining the identity of the Astartes cannot be understated. The period's emphasis on autonomy and survival led many chapters to develop unique traditions and practices that set them apart from the broader Imperium. These distinctions became sources of both pride and division, further fragmenting the Astartes and complicating efforts to restore unity. The Great Reaving was not merely a series of conflicts, but a transformative epic that left an indelible mark on the galaxy. Its unique aspects, from technological rediscoveries to the psychological scars it inflicted, ensure that it remains a focal point of discussion and debate. For those who lived through it, the Great Reaving was a crucible of change, forging new identities and reshaping the Imperium in ways that would resonate for millennia. The Great Reaving brought to prominence individuals whose ambitions, decisions, and ideologies defined the conflict and its aftermath. These figures, both revered and reviled, became symbols of the era, embodying the chaos and complexity of a galaxy torn apart by strife. Among the most discussed personalities was a renegade commander who emerged as a rallying point for rebellion. His charisma and tactical brilliance allowed him to unify disparate factions of dissident Astartes and human militias under a single banner. Driven by a vision of an Imperium freed from the perceived tyranny of centralized control, he sought to create a new order where independence and strength determined power. His greatest strength lay in his ability to inspire loyalty among his followers, but his uncompromising nature and single-minded pursuit of his goals often alienated potential allies. This commander's actions, from leading daring strikes on key Imperial installations to outmaneuvering larger forces, earned him a reputation as both a liberator and a ruthless warmonger. Counterbalancing this figure was an Imperial Navy admiral tasked with containing the rebellion. Known for his meticulous planning and unwavering dedication, the admiral quickly became a symbol of Imperial resilience. His strategies emphasized calculated risks and the preservation of resources, often prioritizing long-term gains over immediate victories. While his disciplined approach allowed him to reclaim lost territories and hold critical systems, his reliance on protocol and hierarchy sometimes hindered his ability to adapt to the fluid nature of the conflict. Despite these limitations, his efforts were instrumental in preventing the rebellion from spreading further, cementing his legacy as a staunch defender of the Imperium. Within the ranks of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a controversial Magos played a pivotal role. Known for her obsession with technological advancement, she viewed the chaos of the Great Reaving as an opportunity to experiment with forbidden and experimental weaponry. Her forge world became a hub for innovation, producing devastating war machines and armaments that turned the tide in several key battles. However, her willingness to prioritize her own research over the Imperium's broader goals led to accusations of betrayal and self-interest. Her dual reputation as a genius inventor and a reckless opportunist made her a divisive figure, both admired and feared by those who dealt with her. One of the most enigmatic figures of the Great Reaving was a shadowy operative whose true allegiance remained a mystery. Known only by a code name, this individual operated in the shadows, orchestrating sabotage, assassinations, and misinformation campaigns that destabilized both loyalist and renegade forces. Their motives were inscrutable, with some believing they acted on behalf of the Imperium, while others speculated they were an agent of chaos or a rogue element pursuing their own agenda. The operative's ability to manipulate events from the background made them a figure of intrigue and paranoia, embodying the uncertainty and mistrust that defined the era. On the other side of the conflict, a renegade Astartes chaplain rose to prominence as a figurehead for rebellion. His fiery rhetoric and unshakable conviction galvanized countless warriors to his cause, framing the rebellion as a righteous struggle against oppression. He wielded not only his weaponry but also his words with devastating effect, inspiring fervent loyalty among his followers. However, his tendency to view dissent within his own ranks as heresy led to internal purges that weakened his forces over time. His legacy remains controversial, as some view him as a martyr for freedom, while others see him as a demagogue who brought ruin to his own cause. The Great Reaving also brought forth unsung heroes among the civilian population. A planetary governor who refused to abandon her people despite overwhelming odds became a symbol of resilience. She organized local militias, negotiated alliances, and leveraged her planet's limited resources to repel invaders, delaying their advance long enough for Imperial reinforcements to arrive. Her courage and resourcefulness earned her the admiration of her people and the grudging respect of her enemies, highlighting the critical role of ordinary individuals in the galaxy's survival. Finally, the Great Reaving was shaped by the actions of a mysterious merchant whose influence spanned both sides of the conflict. Operating from the shadows, this figure supplied critical resources and intelligence to factions across the galaxy, seemingly without allegiance. Some saw this merchant as a profiteer, exploiting the chaos for personal gain, while others believed they were working toward a hidden goal, manipulating events to serve a greater purpose. Their ability to navigate the fractured political landscape and maintain their anonymity ensured their lasting place in the era's legends. These individuals, with their ambitions, strengths, and flaws, became the faces of the Great Reaving. Their stories illustrate the human dimensions of a galactic conflict, where personal decisions and ideologies could reshape entire sectors and leave legacies that endured long after the fighting ceased. Each, in their way, embodied the era's defining characteristics: ambition, resilience, and the relentless struggle for survival and dominance. The Great Reaving remains one of the most enigmatic periods in Imperial history, not only because of its chaos and destruction, but also due to the lingering questions and unresolved mysteries that continue to captivate scholars, historians, and enthusiasts alike. These unanswered questions fuel debates across the galaxy and among fans, adding layers of complexity to an already tumultuous era. One of the most debated mysteries centers around the exact origin of the rebellion. While it is widely accepted that resentment toward the Codex Astartes and the fragmented state of the Imperium were key factors, some argue that the initial spark may have been orchestrated by an unseen force. Was the rebellion truly an organic response to systemic failures, or was it the result of calculated manipulation by an external entity? There are theories that chaos cults, rogue psychers, or even alien factions subtly influenced the early stages of unrest, fanning the flames of rebellion to weaken the Imperium further. The lack of definitive evidence leaves this question open to speculation. Another point of contention lies in the role of the Adeptus Mechanicus during this period. While their actions during the Great Reaving are well documented, their motivations remain unclear. Some believe that certain Forge worlds deliberately withheld critical supplies from loyalist forces, not out of incompetence, but as part of a broader strategy to gain leverage over the Imperium. Others suggest that the Mechanicus' experimentation with ancient technologies during this time may have unintentionally exacerbated the conflict, creating weapons or systems that fell into the wrong hands. The true extent of their involvement and the long-term consequences of their decisions remain topics of heated debate. The timing of the rebellion's escalation also raises questions. Warp anomalies and disturbances in the Astronomicon were particularly pronounced during the Great Reaving, disrupting communication and travel across vast regions. While this is often attributed to the natural instability of the warp, some theorists propose a more sinister explanation. Was the timing coincidental, or did a hidden force deliberately exacerbate these disruptions to isolate regions of the Imperium and make coordinated responses impossible? Theories range from deliberate sabotage by chaos to the influence of an ancient Xenos artifact unearthed during the early skirmishes. One of the most persistent mysteries involves the identities and true motives of certain rogue warbands that emerged during the Great Reaving. Many of these factions appeared seemingly out of nowhere, striking with a level of precision and coordination that suggested premeditation and careful planning. Where did these warbands originate, and how did they acquire the resources and intelligence needed to wage war so effectively? Some speculate that these groups may have been sleeper cells planted during the Horus heresy, waiting for the right moment to strike. Others argue that they were remnants of once loyal forces pushed to rebellion by desperation and isolation. The question of how much of the rebellion was driven by ideology versus opportunism is another area of contention. While many factions frame their actions as a stand against perceived oppression, there is evidence to suggest that personal ambition and the lure of power played equally significant roles. Were the leaders of the rebellion truly motivated by their stated ideals, or were these merely convenient justifications for their actions? The lack of transparency in their records and the contradictory accounts from the era make it difficult to discern their true intentions. Another unresolved issue is the ultimate fate of several key players and factions involved in the Great Reaving. While some were definitively defeated or absorbed into the broader conflict, others seemingly vanished without a trace. What became of these groups? Did they retreat to the galaxy's fringes, continuing their campaigns in isolation, or were they destroyed in battles that went unrecorded? The possibility that some of these factions still exist, waiting to re-emerge, adds an ominous undertone to discussions about this period. Perhaps the most intriguing question is whether the Great Reaving could have been prevented. Was it an inevitable result of the Imperium's structural flaws, or were there missed opportunities to address the underlying issues before they spiraled out of control? Some point to the actions of specific individuals or institutions, arguing that better leadership or a more unified response could have averted the crisis. Others believe that the galaxy's inherent volatility meant that such a conflict was destined to occur, regardless of any efforts to stop it. Finally, there is the question of how much of the truth has been obscured or deliberately suppressed. The Imperium is notorious for its control over historical narratives, and many accounts of the Great Reaving are fragmented, contradictory, or heavily redacted. How much of what is known about this era reflects actual events, and how much has been altered to serve the Imperium's interests? The possibility that critical information remains hidden fuels speculation and ensures that the Great Reaving remains a subject of fascination and intrigue. These unresolved questions and theories ensure that the Great Reaving continues to be a source of endless debate. Each theory, whether grounded in evidence or speculative in nature, adds depth to the story of this tumultuous period, keeping it alive in the collective imagination of the Imperium and beyond. The long-term consequences of the Great Reaving shaped the galaxy in ways that extended far beyond the immediate chaos of the conflict. Its legacy influenced the trajectory of the Imperium and its various factions, altering the balance of power and redefining relationships across the galaxy. As time progressed, the echoes of the Great Reaving continued to ripple through the Imperium, leaving a mix of benefits, detriments, and unanswered questions about humanity's future. One of the most significant outcomes was the permanent fracturing of the Imperium's unity. The Great Reaving demonstrated that even the Imperium's most trusted defenders were capable of rebellion, creating a culture of suspicion that persists to this day. Chapters of Astartes, Imperial governors, and even the Adeptus Mechanicus operate under a veil of mistrust, making cooperation more difficult. While this wariness has, in some ways, helped prevent large-scale betrayals, it has also weakened the Imperium's ability to act cohesively against external threats. The divisions that hardened during this period have never fully healed, leaving the Imperium vulnerable to both internal dissent and coordinated attacks from alien species and chaos forces. Economically, the Great Reaving left scars that have yet to fully mend. The disruption of trade routes, destruction of infrastructure, and loss of key worlds forced the Imperium to adopt a more decentralized economic model. Many sectors that were once heavily reliant on central support developed localized economies out of necessity. While this increased self-sufficiency in some regions, it also led to uneven development and greater disparities between the core and the periphery of the Imperium. Some frontier worlds flourished by leveraging their autonomy, while others descended into poverty and chaos, becoming hotbeds for rebellion and alien incursions. The conflict also had a profound impact on military doctrine. The Great Reaving highlighted the dangers of relying on a rigid command structure, leading to a greater emphasis on flexibility and adaptability. While the Codex Astartes remained a cornerstone of Imperial military policy, many chapters quietly adjusted its teachings to suit their own needs. This divergence in interpretation has allowed the Astartes to respond more effectively to localized threats, but has also widened the ideological gaps between chapters, increasing the likelihood of future conflicts. The psychological toll of the Great Reaving cannot be overstated. For many within the Imperium, the era became a grim reminder of humanity's fragility and the cost of disunity. This collective trauma has been deeply ingrained in the Imperium's culture, fostering an ethos of relentless vigilance and suspicion. While this mindset has helped prevent similar large-scale uprisings, it has also stifled innovation and made the Imperium more insular. Fear of rebellion has led to stricter oversight and harsher punishments for dissent, creating an environment where progress is often sacrificed in the name of stability. One of the more positive long-term consequences of the Great Reaving was the rediscovery and reintegration of lost technologies. The conflict forced many factions to explore forgotten archives and experiment with ancient relics, resulting in the reintroduction of powerful weapons and systems. Some of these innovations have since been standardized, strengthening the Imperium's military capabilities. However, this also led to greater tension between the Adeptus Mechanicus and the rest of the Imperium, as the Mechanicus jealously guards its discoveries and remains wary of sharing them too widely. The Great Reaving also had a profound impact on the perception of the Astartes within the Imperium. Once regarded as infallible champions of humanity, their involvement in the rebellion shattered this image. While the Astartes remain vital to the Imperium's defense, their independence and potential for dissent have become a source of ongoing concern. This has led to the gradual centralization of power within certain loyalist factions, as well as increased scrutiny of chapter activities. Some theorists argue that this shift could eventually lead to the dissolution of the Astartes as autonomous entities, transforming them into a more tightly controlled arm of the Imperium. In a broader sense, the Great Reaving reinforced the perception that the galaxy is an inherently unstable and hostile place. The chaos and unpredictability of the era served as a stark reminder of the Imperium's precarious position in the universe. This has fueled a more defensive and reactionary stance in Imperial policy, with resources and attention focused on preserving what remains rather than pursuing new conquests or expansion. While this approach has helped consolidate the Imperium's power, it has also limited its ability to address emerging threats or adapt to changing circumstances. Perhaps the most significant question raised by the Great Reaving is whether the Imperium has truly learned from its mistakes. While the immediate consequences of the conflict forced reforms and adaptations, the underlying issues that led to the rebellion, mistrust, inequality, and the centralization of power remain unresolved. If these structural flaws are not addressed, some argue that the galaxy is doomed to repeat the cycle of rebellion and chaos. Whether the lessons of the Great Reaving can be fully internalized, or if its legacy will continue to haunt the Imperium, remains uncertain. The Great Reaving's long-term impact is a testament to the interconnectedness of the galaxy and the fragility of even the most powerful institutions. While it exposed the Imperium's weaknesses and created lasting divisions, it also forced humanity to adapt and evolve in ways that have shaped its survival. Whether these changes will ultimately lead to renewal or further decay remains one of the enduring questions of this dark and uncertain era.